He turned down the best job offer of his life, and the CEO got out of her wheelchair to stop him. Elliot Carver walked out of that interview with nothing but his pride and a promise he'd made to a little girl 3 years ago, standing beside a hospital bed, holding a hand that had already gone cold. He didn't walk away because he lacked ambition. He walked away because some things cost more than a salary can cover. But nobody walks away from Marissa Vale. Nobody. This kind of story moves you a man rebuilding his life one stubborn decision at a time. Subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very last word. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The job posting had been up for 11 days before Elliot Carver finally applied, and even then he almost didn't. He'd read the listing 3 separate times over 2 weeks. Regional operations manager, Aldridge Systems, and each time he'd closed his laptop, told himself it wasn't the right fit, and gone back to whatever maintenance contract he was working on. A boiler system in Dearborn, a ventilation overhaul in a distribution center outside Toledo. Kind of work that paid enough to keep the lights on, and left him tired enough to sleep without thinking too hard about things he couldn't change. His daughter Nora was the one who finally pushed him. Not because she'd seen the listing she hadn't, but because she'd come into the kitchen one Tuesday evening, done her homework at the table, in silence while he cooked, and then looked up at him with that particular expression she'd developed over the past 3 years. The one that wasn't quite worry, and wasn't quite pity, and was somehow worse than both. Dad, when's the last time you ate lunch at a table instead of out of a vending machine? Elliot had tried to deflect with a joke. Nora had not laughed. She was 14. She'd stopped laughing at his deflections sometime around her 13th birthday. Around the same time, she stopped asking when things were going to get better and started simply watching him to find out for herself. She had her mother's eyes, the particular shade of dark brown that seemed to catch light from nowhere, and more lately, her mother's patience too. Kind of patience that made a person feel, uncomfortably, that they were being assessed. He submitted the application that night. The offices of Aldridge Systems occupied the upper 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, and the lobby alone told you more about the company than the listing ever had. The floors were stone, the ceilings were high. Everything moved quietly and with purpose, and the people who moved through it did so with the brisk confidence of individuals who had somewhere important to be and were already slightly late. Elliot arrived 12 minutes early, wearing the suit he'd last worn to a funeral, and sat in a chair near the elevators, trying not to look like what he was, a 32-year-old freelance maintenance contractor who hadn't held a salaried position in 3 years, waiting to interview for a role that paid more than double what he'd made in any single year of his working life. The panel was waiting for him on the 31st floor, 3 people arranged around one end of a long conference table, a 4th chair positioned across from them with a water glass and a notepad he'd never use. The HR director, the regional vice president, a senior operations analyst named Gareth, who took notes on everything and said very little, and 1 empty chair. The interview started without explanation for the missing seat. Elliot had done his homework. He'd read everything publicly available about Aldridge, their infrastructure contracts, their expansion into Midwest logistics networks, the profiles of their executive leadership. He knew what they were looking for. Regional operations meant oversight of field teams across a 4-state territory, coordinating maintenance schedules, managing subcontractor relationships, and being the person who got called when something went wrong at 2 in the morning. He knew how to do all of it. He'd been doing versions of it for years, just without the title or the salary. The panel moved through questions with the efficiency of people who had done this many times. Elliot answered them honestly, without overselling. He talked about the distribution center overhaul he'd managed the previous year, coordinating 3 separate subcontractor teams and finishing 4 days ahead of schedule. He talked about a monitoring system failure he'd diagnosed in a manufacturing plant in Akron, the kind of cascading fault that could have shut down production for a week if it had gone undetected another 48 hours. He talked clearly. He didn't ramble. He watched the HR director's pen moving and Gareth's pen moving and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that resembled cautiously confidence. And then the door opened. Marissa Vale came through it in a wheelchair, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who has long since stopped thinking about the chair at all. She was 30 years old younger than Elliot had expected, and she was dressed in charcoal gray, her dark hair pulled back, her expression carrying the specific quality of focused attention that made you feel she had already assessed the room and reached several conclusions before anyone had said a word. She positioned herself at the head of the table without apology or explanation for her late arrival, looked at the notepad in front of her, then looked directly at Elliot. "I apologize for the delay," she said, in a tone that was not quite apologetic. "Continue." The HR director picked up mid-sentence without missing a beat. "This had happened before," Elliot continued. For the next 20 minutes, Marissa Vale said almost nothing. She listened. She made occasional small notations on her pad. Once, she interrupted with a precise technical question about load balancing protocols and legacy monitoring systems, the kind of question that would have stumped someone who'd only read about the problem rather than actually fixed it, and Elliot answered it in detail because he'd fixed exactly that problem in Akron. Something shifted in her expression when he finished. Not dramatically. Just a small recalibration, the kind you make when a thing you expected to be difficult turns out to be less difficult than you'd prepared for. The panel moved to logistics, travel requirements, scheduling flexibility, availability windows. The HR director framed it the way HR directors frame things professionally, thoroughly, presenting the requirement as a reasonable component of an otherwise appealing position. Regional operations meant the territory covered Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Indiana. It meant site visits, emergency deployments, occasional overnight travel with short notice. The expectation was that the candidate would be available to travel anywhere in the territory within 24 hours of request. Elliot listened to all of it. Then he said, "I can't do 24 hours." The room went quiet in a very specific way, not surprised exactly. More like the quiet of people who have been confirmed in something they'd been waiting to have confirmed. The HR director made a small note. Gareth made a small note. The regional VP sat back slightly in his chair. Marissa Vale set down her pen. "Can you explain why?" she asked. It wasn't a hostile question. It was simply a question asked with the directness of someone who found vagueness genuinely annoying and had stopped tolerating it years ago. Elliot considered what to say. Not because he didn't know he'd known, since the first time he'd read the listing, which was why he'd almost not applied, but because there were different ways to explain it, and only one of them was actually true. "I have a 14-year-old daughter," he said. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago. 14-year-olds don't have crises on a schedule, and neither do the people they depend on. Can't promise to be on a plane in 24 hours because I won't promise something I might not be able to keep." No one said anything for a moment. "That's the honest answer," Elliot added, because he'd been in enough rooms to know when people were waiting for a qualifier. Marissa looked at him steadily. "It is," she said. And then she looked down at her notepad and didn't add anything else. The panel wrapped up 10 minutes later, cordially, professionally, without commitment on either side. The HR director told him they'd be in touch, shook his hand. Gareth nodded. The regional VP said it had been a pleasure meeting him. In the way people say things, they mean to be polite rather than accurate. Marissa Vale said nothing further. She was already looking at her pad when Elliot stood. He rode the elevator down alone, 31 floors. He watched the numbers change and thought about Nora eating cereal at the kitchen table this morning, telling him to do his best with the serene confidence of a person who has no particular doubt that her father is capable of doing his best. He thought about how he was going to explain this. The job wasn't the right fit was true enough, in the way that most things simplified to something manageable when you chose the right framing. The lobby was quieter when he came through at mid-morning lull, the rush of arrivals long past. He found his jacket at the coat check, shrugged it on, and started for the revolving doors. He was maybe 15 feet from them when he heard it. The particular soft sound of wheelchair wheels on stone flooring, moving quickly. He turned around. Marissa Vale had come out of the elevator. She was crossing the lobby at a pace that suggested she had not planned this and was, in some ways, still deciding about it. She stopped when she reached him. The distance between them was approximately 6 feet. The lobby moved around them. People arriving, people departing. Security guard speaking into his radio near the front desk, and Marissa Vale sat in the middle of it with the composure of someone who had long ago stopped feeling self-conscious about being stared at. "I want to talk to you," she said before you leave. Elliot waited. "The panel is going to recommend against you," she told him. She said it plainly, without softening it. "The travel restriction is in the job requirements." "It's not a formality." "I know," Elliot said. I'm not sure you understand what I'm telling you. I do. He held her gaze. You're telling me I didn't get the job. She looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression moved, though it was brief and indistinct, not quite frustration, not quite calculation. Whatever it was, she set it aside. Why did you apply? She asked. If you already knew the answer was going to be no. It was a genuine question. He could tell the difference. Because I qualified for everything else, he said. And because sometimes people make exceptions. We're not making an exception. I know that now. A brief silence. Through the revolving doors, traffic moved on the street. Cold November light fell through the glass in flat white angles that turned the lobby floor the color of old paper. I could offer you alternatives, Marissa said. Scheduled travel windows, advanced planning. We have resources, Ms. Vale. He said it quietly, without heat. Appreciate it. I genuinely do. But I didn't ask for the company to restructure its requirements around my situation. And I don't want it to. She studied him. That's an unusual position for someone who needs the job, she said. Probably, Elliot admitted. But my daughter's already had 1 year of uncertain nights and changing plans and wondering whether the person she depends on is coming home. I decided a while ago that I wouldn't do that to her again if I had a choice. He paused. This is a choice. The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Marissa Vale didn't respond immediately. She looked at the revolving doors. Then she looked back at him, a different look than the ones he'd received across the conference table. Less assessment in it. Something more careful. She's 14, Marissa said finally. Yes. And she knows you turned this down? She knows the job wasn't the right fit. Something crossed Marissa's face then. He couldn't have named it precisely. But it was human and complicated in the way that most true things are. And it passed quickly enough that he might have almost missed it. Okay, she said, just that. Elliot nodded. Thank you for your time. He meant it, all of it. The panel, the questions, the fact that she'd come down here to say something she clearly hadn't planned on saying. Turned back toward the revolving doors. He pushed through them. The November air hit him cold and immediate, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment before starting toward the parking structure 2 blocks east. The city moved around him the way it always did, with complete indifference and a great deal of noise. He thought about Nora, about what he'd make for dinner. He thought about the look on Marissa Vale's face in that last moment before he'd turned away. He thought about the fact that she had come down there at all, left whatever meeting she'd been about to take, crossed a lobby she hadn't needed to cross, said something she hadn't prepared to say, and he wasn't sure exactly what to make of it. What he knew was this. He'd answered honestly. He'd made the same choice he would have made a dozen times over. And somewhere under the complicated machinery of what that meant for his finances, for the months ahead, for the contract work that never quite added up to enough, he felt something clear and settled in the way only certain things can make you feel clear and settled. He'd chosen Nora, again, and that had always been, and would always be, the one choice he refused to second-guess. He told her over dinner. Not all of it, not Marissa Vale crossing the lobby, not the conversation by the revolving doors. Just the facts, kept plain the way he'd learned to keep things for her. He'd interviewed. It had gone well. The travel requirements didn't work for their situation. Nora listened, with her fork held still above her plate. Did they offer anything different? She asked. Elliot paused just slightly. Not anything that made sense. She looked at him for a moment, those dark eyes doing the thing they'd started doing in the past year, the careful, quiet look that made him feel, obscurely, like a document being read, and then she nodded and went back to her food. Okay, she said. She didn't ask more. She ate her dinner and talked about a group project due the following Thursday and complained, moderately, about a history assignment that had more reading than it needed to. And by the time they cleared the dishes, she seemed to have moved past it entirely. Elliot washed the plates and told himself she was fine. He told himself she believed him. He wasn't entirely sure either of those things was true. The next 3 weeks were quiet in the way that most disappointing things eventually go quiet, not because the feeling goes away, but because life doesn't pause for it. Elliot picked up a maintenance contract for a cold storage facility in Gary, Indiana. 3 days of work, replacing compressor relays and resealing ducting that had been improperly installed by whoever had done the original build. It was straightforward work that paid a straightforward rate, and he did it efficiently and without complaint, the way he did most things, And at the end of the third day, he drove home on the expressway in the dark and ate reheated soup standing at the kitchen counter because Nora was already asleep. He didn't think about Aldridge, or he tried not to, which was a different thing entirely. What he thought about, more than he wanted to, was the look on Marissa Vale's face in that last moment in the lobby. Not the professional expression she'd worn across the conference table. He'd seen that kind of face before, had learned to read it the way you learn to read weather. He meant the other one. The one that came after he'd explained about Nora, about the choice, about why this particular no was the only answer he could give. The brief, complicated look that had passed across her face and disappeared so quickly, he'd almost decided he'd imagined it. He hadn't imagined it. He just didn't know what to do with it. So he didn't do anything with it. He filed the Gary invoice, checked his pipeline for the following month, and spent a Saturday afternoon helping Nora rehearse for a history presentation on post-war infrastructure policy, which she delivered to the living room wall with the focused intensity of someone who understood that the wall would not be grading her. "You're doing the thing," she told him, midway through her third run. "What thing?" "The thing where you look like you're listening but you're actually somewhere else." Elliot looked at his daughter. 14 years old, standing in their living room, holding a stack of note cards, wearing socks that didn't match, and looking at him with an expression that was equal parts affectionate and exasperated. "I'm listening," he said. "You were." She tilted her head. "Then you weren't." He didn't argue. She was right, and they both knew it. And the easiest thing was to simply pay better attention and not make a thing of it. He paid better attention. She finished her run-through. He gave her feedback on 2 specific transitions where her pacing dropped, and she wrote both notes on the back of a card without being told to, and he thought not for the first time, and not without some complicated feeling that she was considerably more competent than he had been at 14, possibly more competent than he was at 32. "Good," he told her. "I know," she said, without arrogance, just accurately. The warehouse call came on a Tuesday 10 days after Gary. The facility was in Cicero, a mid-sized distribution hub operated by a logistics company that used Aldridge Systems infrastructure for its monitoring network. Elliot didn't know that last part when the call came in. He just knew it was a systems fault with intermittent shutdown events that the on-site technicians couldn't isolate, and the facility manager was running out of patience and production windows. He drove out early before 6 while Nora was still sleeping. Left a note on the counter the way he always did where he was going. Approximate return time. $20 for lunch in case he ran late. He'd been leaving those notes since she was 11. She'd stopped reading them around 13, but he kept writing them anyway. The habit had outlasted its necessity, which was fine. Most useful habits did. The facility was a long, low building with loading bays on 3 sides and an internal monitoring system that had been partially upgraded the previous year. That was the problem, as it turned out. The upgrade had introduced modern environmental sensors: temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure alongside the existing hardware, which was older and operated on a different data transmission cycle. 2 systems weren't talking to each other correctly. The modern sensors were sending readings in real time. The legacy hardware was processing in intervals. When the readings diverged during peak activity, temperature spikes from forklift exhaust, humidity shifts when the loading bays opened, the monitoring system flagged a fault condition and initiated a precautionary shutdown. Not dangerous, not catastrophic, just wrong and recurring and expensive. Elliot found it in 4 hours. He didn't find it by running diagnostics. The diagnostics had already been run and had told everyone what they already knew, which was that a fault existed without explaining why. He found it by sitting with the system documentation for 90 minutes, and then walking the floor for another hour, tracing the actual cable routing and comparing it against the layout schematic, which did not match in 2 locations where someone had made field changes during the upgrade and not updated the documentation. The facility manager, a heavy-set man named Kowalski, who communicated primarily in expressions of varying dissatisfaction, watched Elliot find the discrepancy with the particular skepticism of a person who has been told by 6 technicians that the problem is complicated. "That's it," Kowalski said. "That's the source of it," Elliot said. "The fix is a buffer protocol, tells the legacy system to wait for the modern sensors to complete their cycle before comparing readings. Takes about 40 minutes to implement." Kowalski looked at the cable junction. He looked at Elliot. Why didn't anyone else find that? Because the documentation said the cables ran differently. Elliot capped his pen. If you trust the documentation, you don't look. He implemented the buffer, ran 3 test cycles, confirmed the shutdown events had stopped, and had Kowalski sign the completion report before noon. He was on the expressway by 12:30, eating a gas station sandwich with one hand on the wheel, thinking about nothing in particular. He submitted his report that afternoon, a detailed write-up of the fault cause, the fix, and a recommendation that the facility conduct a full audit of the upgrade documentation against actual physical installation. He wrote his reports thoroughly because his name was on them, and because clear documentation was the difference between a problem that stayed solved and one that came back in 18 months, with a different technician standing over it confused. He sent it to the logistics company's operations contact and forgot about it. He did not know that the logistics company's operations contact forwarded maintenance reports on Aldridge installed infrastructure to Aldridge's field systems team as a matter of contract protocol. He did not know that Aldridge's field systems team flagged his report as unusual, specifically the root cause analysis, which identified a sequencing incompatibility that their own installation team had missed and that no prior technician had isolated. He did not know that the field systems team's summary landed on a desk on the 31st floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago 2 days later. He found out about that part when his phone rang. He was at Nora's school, parent-teacher conferences. He was sitting in a hallway outside the geography classroom, waiting his turn while 2 other parents conferred inside, and his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize, Chicago area code, Downtown Exchange. He almost let it go to voicemail. He answered it. Mr. Carver. The voice was direct and immediately recognizable, though he hadn't heard it in 3 weeks. This is Marissa Vale. I apologize for calling without notice. Do you have a few minutes? He looked at the closed classroom door. A few, he said carefully. I read your report on the Cicero facility. She didn't preamble. The sequencing analysis. I want to understand how you identified the fault. Elliot leaned back in the plastic hallway chair. Down the corridor, a bulletin board displayed student artwork in bright, disordered colors. The documentation didn't match the physical installation, he said. Once I found that, the rest was straightforward. Our installation team completed that upgrade, Marissa said. They didn't catch it. They were working from the documentation. So were you, initially. Yes, he said. But I stopped trusting it when it stopped matching what I was seeing on the floor. A brief pause on the line. That's the part I want to understand, she said. When did you stop trusting it? He thought about it. Not because it was a complicated question, but because most people who asked questions like that were looking for a simple answer, and the actual answer wasn't simple. When the shutdown pattern didn't match what a true equipment fault would produce, he said. The intervals were too regular. Equipment fails randomly. Software logic doesn't. Another pause, this one longer. Can I ask you something, Ms. Vale? Go ahead. Is this a phone call or is this an interview? There was a half second, just a half second, before she answered. It's a phone call, she said, with the option to become something else, depending on how it goes. He almost smiled. Fair enough. The geography classroom door opened. A mother came out, made brief eye contact with Elliot, and held the door. He held up one finger a minute, and she let it close again. I have to go, Elliot said. Parent-teacher conference. Of course. No trace of irritation. Would you be available to continue this conversation this week? At your convenience. I can do Thursday afternoon. Thursday afternoon works. A pause. Thank you for answering. You called, he said simply, and ended the call. He went into the geography classroom and sat across from a teacher who told him Nora was performing well above grade level and showed particular aptitude for analytical reasoning, which Elliot found simultaneously unsurprising and quietly wonderful. Thursday's conversation lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, which neither of them had intended. It started in a conference room on the 31st floor of the same building. A different room, smaller and less formal than the interview space, with 2 windows that faced north and a table that seated 6, though it was only the 2 of them. Marissa had a legal pad. Elliot had his field notes from Cicero, because he'd anticipated questions and had learned long ago that walking in prepared was better than walking in confident. She asked him to walk her through his diagnostic sequence from the beginning. He did, in detail, including the 2 wrong turns he'd taken, before finding the documentation discrepancy which he included because they were part of the actual sequence, and because leaving them out would have been tidier but less honest. Marissa listened without interrupting. She made notes occasionally. When he finished, she asked 4 follow-up questions, each of them precise and technically substantive, and Elliot answered them the same way. He'd answered the one in the interview 3 weeks ago, clearly, from direct experience, without inflating what he knew or apologizing for what he didn't. At some point, the conversation shifted. He wasn't sure exactly when. It moved from the Cicero fault to the general pattern of legacy to modern integration problems in infrastructure systems, which was a broader conversation he'd been having mostly with himself for the past year and a half, forming opinions in isolation that had never had anyone to test against. Marissa Vale turned out to be the kind of person who tested an idea by pushing on it hard, without warning, to see if it held. The first time she pushed back on something, he said a clean, direct disagreement about load cycle management in mixed generation systems. He felt something sharpen in the room. Pushed back on her pushback. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Walk me through that." He did. She listened. She made more notes. She said, "I think you're right about the cycle intervals, but wrong about where the authority for the override should sit." And then she explained why. And she was clear and technically precise, and he spent about 90 seconds working through it in his head before conceding the point. "That's fair," he said. She looked at him. "Most people don't say that. Most people are wrong and don't say that," he said. "I try to limit it to times when I'm actually wrong." Something changed in her expression then, not dramatically, but genuinely. A small recalibration, similar to the one he'd seen in the interview, but quieter. Less about assessment and more about something else he couldn't quite name. They talked for another hour after that. About the broader pattern of installation gaps across Aldridge's field network. About the systemic question of whether documentation audits should precede upgrade sign-offs rather than follow them. About what it actually meant to trust a system versus trusting the people who installed it. At some point, Marissa's assistant knocked and opened the door and reminded her of a 4 o'clock call, and Marissa looked at her watch and said, "Push it 15 minutes, and the assistant disappeared. Elliot began gathering his notes. "I'd like to offer you a consulting assignment," Marissa said. 3 weeks. Assessment of the integration documentation across 6 facilities in the Midwest Territory. You'd write a summary report with recommendations. He looked at her across the table. "That's a significant scope for 3 weeks. It's what I need done. If the timeline doesn't work, tell me and we'll adjust it." He thought about the scope. About his current contracts, the Gary facility had been his last significant one, and his next scheduled start wasn't for 5 weeks. He thought about Nora's school calendar. Debate showcase in 6 weeks. History project due Thursday, done. Volleyball season wrapped up. No weekend commitments that would require him to be in 2 places. Thought about the fact that he was sitting on the 31st floor of a building he'd left 3 weeks ago with nothing but his dignity, and that the person across the table from him had read a maintenance report he'd sent to someone else and picked up a phone. "What's the travel component?" he asked. 6 facilities. "I can give you a schedule in advance, no unplanned overnight requirements. Conflict arises, we manage it with a remote assessment. Nothing moves without you knowing the timeline." He studied her for a moment. "You cleared that before asking me." "I cleared it before I called you Thursday morning," she said simply. He was quiet for a second. Not surprised exactly. But something about it, the directness of it, the fact that she'd solved the problem before presenting it, was something he didn't have an immediate response to. "Okay," he said. "Send me the formal scope and I'll review it. I'll have it to you by Friday." He stood. She didn't extend her hand, she rarely did. He'd notice later. Not because she was unfriendly, but because she'd learned that the movement required a particular adjustment in the chair, and she'd decided somewhere along the way that it wasn't worth the management. She nodded instead, a crisp, direct nod that conveyed the same thing a handshake would have. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "You asked," he said. Same as before, she almost smiled. He was fairly sure of it. The scope document arrived Friday afternoon. It was thorough, precise, and exactly as described. Schedule attached to it laid out facility visits on specific dates over a 22-day period, with remote assessment options built in for 2 of the 6 sites if Elliot preferred. He reviewed it twice. It was the most professionally prepared contractor scope he'd received in 3 years of freelance work. He sent back one clarifying question about reporting format, whether she wanted a single summary document or individual facility reports, and Marissa responded within 4 minutes with a clean, direct answer, single summary with facility-level appendices. He signed the agreement and returned it. The first facility was a distribution hub in Columbus, Ohio. He drove down on a Monday, spent 2 days on the floor working through installation records and comparing them against physical layouts, the same way he'd done in Cicero, and found 2 additional sequencing discrepancies that weren't generating active shutdown events yet, but would, eventually, under peak load conditions. He documented them with photographs, cable routing diagrams, and a clear cause and effect analysis. He sent the facility report to Marissa's assistant, as instructed. Marissa emailed him directly at 8:30 that evening. The Columbus documentation is excellent. The second discrepancy at Bay 7, did you consider whether it might also affect the thermal override during shutdown sequence, or only during normal operation? He was sitting at the kitchen table. Nora was doing homework across from him, and he'd been reviewing his notes for the following day's drive to the second facility, which was in Indianapolis. He looked at the email. He thought about Bay 7. He got up, went to the kitchen counter, unrolled the cable diagram he'd sketched during the site visit, and looked at the override pathway. She was right. He'd missed it. He stood there for a moment, feeling the particular mild discomfort of being caught missing something, and then he sat back down and wrote back, "You're correct. I missed it. We'll add a notation to the Columbus appendix and flag the thermal override pathway separately. I'll verify it's an isolated case or pattern when I'm at Indianapolis tomorrow." Her reply came in 7 minutes. It's probably isolated, but worth the check. Safe drive. He looked at those 2 words at the end, safe drive, for a moment longer than was necessary. He wasn't sure what to make of Marissa Vale. He'd been working under the assumption that she was a type, the hyper-capable executive who ran on controlled authority and tolerated other people's competence when it served a purpose. He'd met that type. He knew how to navigate it. But she wasn't quite fitting the mold, and the ways she wasn't fitting it were small and specific enough that he hadn't been able to decide whether they were significant. She'd come down to the lobby after the interview when she hadn't needed to. She'd cleared the travel logistics before asking him. She'd read his Columbus report in the same evening he'd sent it and found the thing he'd missed. She'd said safe drive. He told himself these were simply professional observations about a thorough and attentive colleague. He was aware that this was a simplification. The 3-week assignment became the shape of his days. He drove to facilities, worked the floors, mapped the gaps, documented the causes, and each evening from hotel rooms in Columbus and Indianapolis and Cincinnati, from his own kitchen table on the days he was home, he exchanged emails with Marissa Vale that started as professional and technical and gradually became something harder to categorize. She was more accessible than he'd expected. Not personally, she maintained a clean professional distance that he found, if anything, easier to work within than warmth he'd have had to figure out what to do with. But intellectually, she was generous in a way he hadn't anticipated. She'd email him an observation about a system problem that was peripheral to his current assignment, not because it was relevant to his report, but because she'd been thinking about it and wanted to see what he'd say. She'd push back on his conclusions not to win the argument, but to stress test the reasoning. Started doing the same to her. Carefully at first, then less carefully as the weeks went on, because she pushed back on hedging as hard as she pushed back on anything else. "I need your actual opinion," she told him once, over a phone call about the Indianapolis facility, when he'd framed a recommendation in language that left more room than it needed to. "That is my opinion," he said. "It's your opinion wrapped in enough qualifiers to survive being wrong," she said, which is not the same thing. "If you think the override pathway requires a manual review protocol, say that. Don't say it may warrant consideration of a manual review protocol." He was quiet for a moment. "The override pathway requires a manual review protocol," he said. "Thank you," she said, and moved on. He drove home from Cincinnati on the last day of the second week and arrived at 6:30 to find Nora at the kitchen table, headphones around her neck, textbook open, eating cereal for dinner because she'd forgotten to defrost the chicken he'd left in the refrigerator. "You were supposed to move that to the counter this morning," he said. "I know," she said, without guilt. He put the chicken on the counter for tomorrow and made eggs instead, and they ate together, and she told him about a conflict with a girl named Sophie in her debate groups that had been escalating for and had finally resolved itself through the intermediary of someone named Devin, who apparently had the social facility of a career diplomat. "And that fixed it?" Elliot said, mostly. Nora ate a forkful of eggs. "Sophie's still annoyed at me, but she's being professional about it. That's all you can ask for. That's what I told Devin." She paused. Is the consulting thing going okay? Yeah, he said. It's going well. The lady from Aldridge? He looked at her. That's the company. Yeah. Nora had the look on again. Careful, quiet look. Is she nice? He stopped. Considered. She's direct, she knows what she wants, and she says so. So you like working with her? I like working with people who know what they want, he said, and kept his voice neutral and didn't look up from his plate. Nora said, in a tone that conveyed several things without stating any of them, and went back to her cereal and didn't ask anything else. He was not sure whether he was relieved about that or not. On the last day of the third week, a Thursday, Elliot's final facility in Milwaukee, he sent Marissa the completed draft of the summary report. 18 pages, 6 appendices, 47 photographs, and a set of recommendations organized by urgency, scope, and estimated implementation cost. He drove home from Milwaukee in the dark, through light snow that hadn't been forecast, and got back to the apartment just after 9:30. Nora was already in bed. He stood in the kitchen for a minute, coat still on, too tired to decide what to do first. His phone buzzed on the counter. A text from Marissa Vale, which was unusual. They'd communicated almost exclusively by email and occasional phone call. Report received. It's thorough. More than I expected from 3 weeks. A pause between messages. He could see the typing indicator. Then I'll be in touch about next steps. He set the phone down. He was standing in his kitchen, coat on, tired from a long drive, and there was something in those 2 messages, in the bluntness of the compliment and the openness of next steps, that he couldn't quite neutralize the way he usually neutralized things that needed neutralizing. Took his coat off. He got a glass of water. He stood at the kitchen counter and thought, for longer than was probably useful, about what next steps meant. Whether it meant more contract work, an extension, something else. Whether it meant what it felt like it might mean, and what it would mean if it did mean that, and what he was supposed to do with the awareness that he'd spent 3 weeks talking to someone who challenged it in ways he hadn't been challenged in years, and that he'd started looking forward to her emails in the evenings in a way that had nothing to do with documentation gaps or legacy sequencing protocols. He didn't have an answer. He was a practical man, and practical men were supposed to be good at answers. But the truth was that he was better at fixing systems than at understanding what was happening in his own chest when it came to certain things. He drank his water. He checked on Nora. She was asleep, her desk lamp still on, a book fallen half off the mattress. He turned off the lamp. He went to bed. He told himself the next steps would clarify themselves in due time, and that the only thing he needed to do tonight was sleep. He slept. But it took a while. The next steps Marissa had referenced turned out to be a meeting scheduled for the following Tuesday in person, 31st floor, to discuss the summary report and what came after it. Elliot confirmed the time, put it in his phone, and spent the weekend doing the ordinary things that weekends required: groceries, laundry, a leaking bathroom faucet that had been on his list for 2 weeks, helping Nora run her debate arguments for an upcoming round-robin tournament. The debate topic was about infrastructure investment priorities in post-industrial cities, which struck him as either a remarkable coincidence or the universe having a sense of humor. He sat on the couch and played opposition to her arguments, pushing back on her logic, and she handled it with the cool competence she'd been developing all year, not rattled by pushback, not aggressive about it, just methodical and clear. She'd gotten good at this. "Where'd you learn to argue like that?" he asked, after she'd dismantled one of his counterpoints with a precision that left him with nothing useful to say. Nora shrugged. "You, mostly." He didn't know what to do with that, so he just said okay and moved to the next argument. The Tuesday meeting was productive and efficient and lasted 90 minutes. Marissa had read the report closely. She'd flagged 8 specific passages with questions or comments, and she went through each one with the focused directness that Elliot had come to understand was simply how she processed information. She didn't small talk her way into a meeting. She arrived at the substance and worked through it. Her question at the end was the one he'd been half expecting. "What would you do," she said, "if the problem isn't the documentation? If the documentation is just where the problem shows up?" He'd been thinking about exactly this since Milwaukee. "You mean the installation process itself?" "I mean the accountability structure," she said. "Your report identifies the gap between what's recorded and what's built. But someone signed off on each of those installations. Multiple people in some cases. The documentation failures are symptoms. Of what? of a system that makes one person responsible for everything at the point of completion, she said. When one person signs off, one person's blind spot is the whole system's blind spot. He looked at her across the table. She was right. He'd seen it in every facility, a single project lead, whose initials appeared on every sign-off sheet, whose understanding of the installation was the only understanding that officially existed. You need distributed verification, he said. Tell me what that looks like. And that was how he ended up spending another 2 hours on the 31st floor, working through the architecture of a problem he hadn't been hired to solve, but that had been forming in the back of his mind since Cicero, while Marissa Vale asked precise, uncomfortable questions and pushed back on everything that wasn't fully thought through. He drove home that afternoon with the particular energy of a mind that has been running at full capacity for several hours, not tired, exactly, but wound up in a way that took time to settle. What he didn't know, pulling into the parking space behind his building at 4:20 on a Tuesday afternoon, was that his daughter had been home from school since 3:30, and that she'd spent 45 minutes of that time looking for a pen in his desk drawer. He'd had a habit, since the consulting assignment started, of keeping Marissa's emails printed and organized in a folder on his desk, not all of them, just the ones that contained technical material he wanted to reference during site visits without pulling out his phone. Documentation questions, system notes, the Columbus Bay 7 correction. The folder was in the top left drawer of his desk, and Nora knew about it the way kids know about organizational habits without ever being told by proximity, by years of shared space, by the simple fact of living in a small apartment with one parent who kept things in consistent places. She hadn't been looking for the folder. She'd been looking for the good scissors, which migrated unpredictably through the apartment, because neither of them had ever established a fixed location for them, and she'd opened the desk drawer, looking for scissors, and found the folder. She might have closed the drawer without looking. She almost certainly would have, if the page on top hadn't been the email thread from the Thursday after his interview, the thread that had started with Marissa's initial offer of alternatives. Scheduled travel, transportation assistance, additional support. Nora pulled the folder out. She sat at his desk and read it. She read the whole thread, 6 emails across 3 exchanges, starting with Marissa's offer and ending with Elliot's final refusal, which he had phrased with perfect, measured, considered courtesy. I appreciate the company's flexibility, but I don't think a restructured arrangement serves either party well at this stage. I'll withdraw my application. Thank you for your time. She read it twice. Then she put the folder back in the drawer, found the scissors in the kitchen cabinet above the microwave where they'd apparently been for 2 weeks, and finished the project she'd needed them for. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when Elliot came in. He could tell immediately that something was different. She had the particular stillness of someone who has decided to be calm about something and is working at it. It was a stillness he recognized. He'd seen it in the mirror. Hey, he said. Hey, she said. He set his bag down, opened the refrigerator, stood looking at it without seeing it. How was the meeting, she asked. Good, productive. He pulled out leftover pasta from 2 nights ago. You eat yet? Not yet. He put the pasta on. She did her homework. Kitchen filled with the sound of a burner clicking on, and water beginning to move in a pot, and for a few minutes it was just an ordinary Tuesday evening, and he almost decided he'd been wrong about the stillness. Then she said, Dad, can I ask you something? Her voice was careful, not aggressive, just careful. Sure, he said. After your interview. The one at Alderidge. She paused. Did they actually say no, or did they offer you something else? Turned from the stove. Nora was looking at him from the kitchen table. Her homework was in front of her, but her pen was set down. She was watching him the way she'd been watching him for the past year, that patient, assessing. Look, but there was something harder in it tonight. Something he hadn't seen before. He understood, in the space of about 2 seconds, that this conversation had been approaching for longer than tonight. He just hadn't known what shape it would take. What did you find? He asked. It wasn't an accusation. He kept his voice level. The folder in your desk, she said. I was looking for scissors. I didn't mean to read it, but I did. He turned the burner down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. They offered alternatives, he said. I turned them down. You told me the job wasn't the right fit. It wasn't. Because you turned down the alternatives, she said. Not because they said no. He looked at his daughter. She was 14 years old, sitting in a kitchen chair in a hoodie with a fraying cuff, and she was looking at him with an expression he did not have a name for. Not angry, not betrayed, something more complicated than both and harder to answer than either. I turned them down because the alternatives still meant unpredictable travel, he said. And unpredictable travel means me, she said. Yes, you turned it down because of me. Because of my responsibility to you, he said. There's a difference. Is there? She said it quietly, not combatively, like a genuine question. He didn't answer immediately. Outside, a car went by. The pasta water had started to boil, and he registered it distantly, without moving. Nora, I was 11, she said, when Mom died. I was 11, and I had 3 different people watching me in 2 weeks, because you were at the hospital, and then you were handling the arrangements, and then I don't even know what you were doing. I just know you weren't there. And I know I didn't know from one day to the next who was going to pick me up from school, or who was going to be at the apartment when I got home. Paused. Her voice was steady. He didn't know how it was steady. His own chest had done something complicated at I was 11. I know that, Elliot said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. I know you know that, she said. That's the part I'm trying to talk to you about. You know what happened. You've been carrying it around like an explanation for every decision you make. Dad, she stopped. Took a breath. I'm 14. I'm not 11 anymore. I know how old you are. I don't think you do. She picked up her pen and set it down again, a nervous motion she probably wasn't aware of. Because if you did, you wouldn't have turned down that job to protect me from something that happened 3 years ago. You would have asked me first. He sat with that for a moment. You would have been 12 when I started making this particular decision, he said. I wasn't going to put that on a 12-year-old. I'm not talking about then, she said. I'm talking about the interview. I'm talking about 3 months ago. I was almost 14. And you looked at me across this table and told me the job wasn't the right fit. She paused. You lied to me. The word landed in the room. He didn't argue it, because she was right, and arguing it would have been a second lie. I simplified, he said. Dad, yes, he said. I lied to you. I simplified something complicated into something simple, because I didn't want to have the conversation. Why? He looked at his daughter. Really looked at her, the fraying cuff, the pen she kept picking up and setting down, the careful steadiness she was maintaining with an effort he could see in the small muscles around her eyes. Because I didn't know how to explain a decision that was partly about you without making you feel responsible for it, he said. And I didn't want you to feel responsible. Something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but adjusting, like a picture being brought into slightly better focus. I wouldn't have felt responsible, she said. I would have felt included. He didn't say anything. There's a difference, she said, and he recognized his own words coming back to him, and the recognition went through him like something cold. Pasta water was boiling hard now. He got up and turned the burner down and stood at the stove for a moment, his back to her, getting his footing. He'd told himself for 3 years that the decisions he made about their life together were acts of protection. He'd built the whole framework of the past 3 years on that: the contract work, the careful boundaries, the promises he'd made, standing in a hospital room. Protection was the architecture that held everything up. But Nora was telling him carefully, without dramatics, in the voice of a person who had thought about this before tonight, that the architecture was built around a version of her that was 3 years out of date. He turned back around. The offer they made, he said. Scheduled travel. Fixed windows. I could have made it work, probably. I know, she said. I didn't take it because I was afraid, he said. It came out without much preparation, which meant it was true. Not of the travel. Of what would happen if I got it wrong. If I promised you it would be predictable and then it wasn't. If I promised you it was safe and then something happened. He stopped. I've already broken promises to you that I didn't know I was making. I didn't want to make a new one I couldn't keep. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Dad, she said quietly, you chose me. You've chosen me every time for 3 years. I know that, I see it, she paused. But you never asked me. He stood at the stove and felt those words move through him. You never asked me. He'd made decisions about their life, about what she needed, what she could handle, what she was ready for, based on his memory of an 11-year-old sitting in a hospital waiting room, who didn't know which adult was going to take her home that night. He'd been protecting that child. Fiercely, completely, at the cost of most of the opportunities that had come through his door in 3 years. But that child was standing in front of him in a kitchen, in a fraying hoodie, telling him with the patient precision of someone who had clearly thought about this for longer than tonight, that she was not 11 anymore, and that she would have liked to have been asked. He sat back down at the table. "I'm sorry," he said, not in the reflexive, deflecting way. He meant it specifically. "I'm sorry I lied to you about the job. And I'm sorry I've been making decisions about your life without including you in them." She looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. "That's it? What do you want me to say? That it's fine?" She shook her head. "It's not fine. But you said sorry like you meant it, so." She picked up her pen. "Okay." He almost smiled. He held it together. "Okay," he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Not the loaded kind. Just a pause after something heavy has been put down. "Consulting thing," Nora said, without looking up from her homework. "The lady who owns the company. You like working with her." It wasn't a question. He'd noticed that about Nora. She stated observations as facts and let you decide what to do with them. "I do," he said. "Is she good at her job?" "She's very good at her job." Nora wrote something on her paper. "Is there more work after the consulting thing?" "Possibly," he said. "We talked about it today. Are you going to take it?" He looked at his daughter. She was writing, not looking at him, in the particular concentrated way she had when she was pretending something was casual. "I'm going to think about it," he said, "and then I'm going to talk to you about it. And then we're going to decide together. Both of us." Nora stopped writing. She looked up. Something moved in her face that she didn't bother controlling, something young and complicated, and relieved in a way that told him, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly how long she'd been waiting for that specific sentence. "Okay," she said, and went back to her homework. He got up and finished making dinner, and they ate at the kitchen table. And the conversation moved on to other things: Devon's diplomatic success with Sophie, an extra credit option in her science class, whether they needed more cereal. It was ordinary and imperfect, and the food was fine but not particularly special, and outside the apartment window the city made its usual indifferent noise. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them made a thing of it. He didn't sleep well that night. Not because anything was unresolved. Exactly the conversation with Nora had resolved the specific thing it had needed to resolve, and he believed the apology had landed the way he'd meant it. He didn't sleep because after the immediate business of the confrontation was finished and the evening had moved on, he was left alone, with the part that was harder to deal with. He lay in the dark and thought about what Nora had said, but not the practical part of it, not the part about decisions and inclusion and being asked. The part that had come before all of that. The part about being 11, 3 different caregivers in 2 weeks, not knowing who would pick her up from school. He'd known all of this. He'd carried it for 3 years as a weight and a reason and an explanation. What he hadn't let himself look at closely, not this closely, not in a lit kitchen with his daughter looking steadily at him, was what it meant about him, about the nature of the protection he'd been offering. Because protection that never consults the person being protected isn't quite protection. It's something else. It's a story you tell yourself about what you're doing while you're actually doing something else. He'd been afraid. That was the true center of it. Not of travel requirements or contract instability or the mechanical logistics of getting from one city to another on short notice. He'd been afraid of repeating the one specific catastrophic failure of his adult life, failing to be present for the person who needed him most at the worst possible time. He'd been afraid of it so completely and for so long that he'd made the avoidance of it into a kind of identity. Elliot Carver, the man who chooses his daughter, the man who says no to the things that might make him absent. It was a clean story. It was an admirable story, framed correctly. And it had cost him 3 years of constricted choices and a job he'd actually wanted, and possibly other things he'd been too focused on the story to notice. The grief underneath it was not new. He'd known, abstractly, that it was there, that 3 years of decisions had been shaped by the sudden, catastrophic loss of a woman he'd built his life around. But grief has a way of hiding inside its own justifications, and his had hidden extraordinarily well inside the language of responsibility and protection and fatherhood. Nora had found the seam, with scissors she was looking for. He almost laughed at that. He was alone, in the dark, and he almost laughed. And then he didn't, because the feeling underneath the almost law was something considerably less funny, a 3-year-old weight that he'd finally, in the space of one dinner, allowed himself to actually look at. He missed his wife. He missed her with a specific physical completeness that hadn't dulled the way people told him it would. It had just become familiar, like learning to walk differently after an injury not healed, but adapted, so thoroughly adapted that you forgot, most of the time, that anything had changed. He missed her, and he'd been terrified, without ever saying it in those words, of letting himself want things again, of letting himself be invested in outcomes that could be taken from him. Because you can protect yourself from certain kinds of loss by not having the things that make loss possible. Which meant that Nora's argument about the job was only the visible part of a much larger and longer-running problem. He lay in the dark for a while. Then he got up, went to the kitchen, and made himself a cup of coffee he didn't need, and sat at the table where they'd had dinner, and stayed there for a while longer. He called Marissa the next morning. He'd intended to wait until their next scheduled conversation. He wasn't entirely sure why he didn't, except that the clarity he'd found in the previous night's dark kitchen hours had a limited shelf life, and he wanted to use it before the ordinary pressure of daily life could find reasons to set it aside. She picked up on the second ring. "Carver, good morning," he said. "Do you have a few minutes? I have a call at 9. It's 8:20, yes." He looked at the window. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of Chicago winter morning that arrives already tired. "I've been thinking about the accountability structure," he said. "The distributed verification model." "Okay. I think the problem isn't just the sign-off structure," he said. "I think it's the assumption that any system should depend entirely on one person's presence or judgment, not just its sign-off across the whole operation." He'd worked this out somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table. "Elaborate," Marissa said. "Your regional facilities depend on regional managers who depend on individual technical leads who are the only people who fully understand their particular system configuration. When something goes wrong at 2 in the morning, there's one person who gets called. And if that person is unavailable, the response time doubles because the next person has to rebuild context from scratch." He paused. "That's not a staffing problem. It's an architecture problem." Silence on the line. He knew this silence she was thinking, not absent. "Go on," she said. "The fix isn't to find more reliable individuals. To build systems that don't require any individual to be irreplaceable." He said it plainly, the way he'd said things to her for 3 weeks, without qualifiers, without room. Stop making one person indispensable. Build redundancy into the knowledge base, the authority structure, the response protocols. If I'm the only person who can fix something, I haven't solved the problem, I've just delayed it. Another silence. "You're describing a structural redesign of our field operations model," she said.
"I know."
"That's considerably outside the scope of a 3-week consulting assignment." "I know," he said it again. "Why are you telling me this now, the morning after you finished the assignment?" He thought about Nora at the kitchen table. The careful steadiness. "You chose me, but you never asked me." "Because I stopped trusting the documentation," he said, and started looking at what was actually there. Marissa was quiet for a long moment. "I need to take this call at 9, she said, "but I want to continue this conversation. Can you come in Thursday?" "Yes, I'll have Diane send you the time." A pause. "Carver." "Yeah, this is a significant idea," she said. Not enthusiastically, that wasn't how she said things. Just accurately. "I want you to know I'm taking it seriously." "Okay," he said. "See you Thursday." She ended the call. He set the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside the window, the gray morning was getting lighter in the slow, reluctant way that February mornings did, and the apartment was quiet because Nora was still asleep. And he sat in the kitchen with his coffee and felt something he hadn't felt in a while, not happiness exactly, but something that moved in the same direction. A sense of forward motion that didn't feel like flight. He'd spent 3 years building walls out of good intentions. He'd done it for Nora, and he'd done it for himself, and both things were true at the same time. What he hadn't done, what he'd been too careful and too afraid to do, was ask whether the walls were still necessary, whether the person he'd been building them around had grown past them, and whether he had. He finished his coffee. He wrote a note on the back of an envelope Thursday. Alderidge, 10 a.m., and put it on the refrigerator where Nora would see it, because he'd promised they would discuss things, and the note was a small beginning. Then he went to wake his daughter up for school. And the morning began the way mornings did imperfectly, incompletely, with none of the clarity that the previous night had briefly offered, and all of the ordinary specific detail that actually constituted a life. Nora came out of her room with her hair half done and one sock on, looking for the other one. "Check under the couch," Elliot said. She checked. It was there. She pulled it on without comment, dropped into a chair, and looked at the envelope on the refrigerator. Aldridge again, she said. Thursday, he said. We should talk about it tonight, if you're up for it. She looked at him. The careful look, but different from last night, less guarded in it now. Yeah, she said. Okay. Poured her cereal, and she ate it standing at the counter, which was a habit he'd long since stopped trying to correct, and she left for school with her bag over one shoulder and the second half of a granola bar in her hand. And the door closed behind her, and Elliot stood in the kitchen a moment. He thought about the note on the refrigerator. He thought about what he'd said to Marissa this morning. Stop making one person indispensable, and how the same idea, said differently, applied to every arrangement he'd built around the belief that he alone had to hold everything together. He was not the only person who could fix something. He was just the one who'd been afraid to let anyone else try. The Thursday meeting ran long, the way their conversations had a habit of doing. Elliot arrived at 10 with a 12-page document he'd written over 2 evenings, not a formal proposal, just his thinking organized into something readable. The distributed authority model laid out in plain language with 3 concrete implementation scenarios. He'd written it the same way he wrote his field reports, clearly, specifically, without inflating the idea or apologizing for it. Marissa read it while he sat across the table, not skimming, actually reading, which he could tell by the way her eyes moved and the occasional small pause before she turned a page. She had the legal pad, but she didn't write on it while she read. She finished, set the document down, and looked at him. Scenario 2, she said. The phased rollout. Walk me through the deputy authority structure. He walked her through it. The core of the model was simple in the way most useful things are simple. Every operational decision point that currently required a single individual's judgment would require 2 people to hold the relevant context, not one primary and one backup who had to be briefed from scratch in an emergency, but 2 people with genuine current exercised knowledge of the system. Deputies wouldn't be understudies. They'd be participants. They'd make decisions in their own domains routinely, so that when a crisis required them to step into the lead role, they were already moving rather than starting. The secondary piece, the one that had come to him at 3 in the morning at the kitchen table, was about authority. Real authority, not delegated authority that could be recalled the moment the primary person decided they wanted it back. If a deputy's decision could be overridden without consequence, the deputy wasn't actually a deputy. They were a formality, and formalities failed under pressure, exactly when you needed them not to. Marissa pushed back on this. Hard. You're describing a structure where regional deputies can commit company resources without manager approval, she said. Within defined parameters, he said. Not unlimited authority, but real authority within those parameters. The kind that doesn't require a phone call to someone else before acting. The liability exposure on that is less than the exposure from a 4-hour response delay because the one person who knew the system was unavailable, he said, which is what happened in Cicero, which is what almost happened in Bay 7 in Columbus. One person's knowledge, one person's availability. That's the single point of failure, and it runs through your entire field operation. She looked at him steadily. She had the expression she got when she was working something through, not resistant, just rigorous. There was a difference, and he'd learned it. If I approve this for a pilot, she said slowly, I need a candidate project. Something with enough scope to test the model, but contained enough that a failure doesn't cost us a major client relationship. The Midwest rollout, he said. She'd mentioned it once, briefly, 2 weeks earlier, a planned expansion of Aldridge's monitoring infrastructure across a network of regional distribution hubs in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Illinois. 12 facilities, 18 months of projected implementation, significant contract value. That's not a small test, she said. No, he agreed. The right shape. Multiple facilities, multiple teams, geographically distributed. If the model works there, you have evidence. If it fails, you learn specifically where it fails before you apply it to something larger. And who leads it? He'd known the question was coming. He'd been turning the answer over since he'd written the proposal. You should put it out to competition, he said. Contractors and internal candidates both. I'll submit a proposal if the scope and terms work for my situation. But I don't want the project handed to me because I wrote the model. Marissa looked at him for a moment. Why not? Because a model that only gets tested when its author is running it hasn't been tested, he said. It's just been demonstrated. If I win the competition on the merits, the result means something. If you hand it to me, we won't know. She studied him across the table, with the particular expression she'd been giving him more frequently over the past weeks, the one that was harder to categorize than her professional assessments, the one he'd been carefully not thinking too hard about. "You're aware," she said, "that this significantly complicates my decision."
I know.
"I was planning to offer you the project directly." "I know," he said again. "Don't." A pause. She picked up her pen, set it down. "Fine," she said. "I'll structure a competitive process. You'll receive the same brief as every other candidate. 6 weeks to submission. I won't be involved in the evaluation panel. That's more than fair." "It's not generosity," she said. "It's what the model requires." She paused. "Your model." He almost smiled. "Our model," he said, and she looked at him briefly in a way that he chose, deliberately, not to analyze. He told Nora about it that evening, at the kitchen table, the way he'd promised he would. Not everything, not the competitive process, not the details of the proposal, but the broad shape of it, a potential project, multi-month, significant scope, travel that would be planned and predictable, a chance to build something. Nora listened. She ate her pasta. She asked 3 specific questions. How often would he be away? Would she need to change any of her school schedule? And was this the same company as before? And he answered all 3 honestly, including the parts where the answer was, "I don't know yet." "What happens if someone else gets the project?" she asked. "Then I didn't win it," he said, "and I find something else." "But you want this one?" "Yes," he said, "I want this one." She nodded. She twirled pasta on her fork. "Then make a good proposal," she said simply. He wrote the proposal over 2 weeks. In the evenings after Nora was in bed, at the same kitchen table that had become, in the past month, something like his working anchor point. The document went through 4 drafts. He was harder on it than he'd been on anything he'd written, professionally tearing apart arguments that sounded good but had weak foundations, rebuilding them from the actual mechanics of what the model required and why. He submitted it on a Thursday. He didn't tell Marissa it was done. He sent it to Diane, her assistant, through the process that had been established for all submissions, the same as every other candidate. He received an automated confirmation email. Then he waited. Call came on a Tuesday afternoon in early March, while he was replacing a water-damaged ceiling panel in a commercial space in Evanston, a small maintenance contract he'd picked up to fill the gap while the proposal was under review. He almost didn't answer. His hands were occupied and the ladder wasn't the most stable he'd ever been on, but he saw the Aldridge main number and came down the ladder, faster than was probably advisable. "Carver," he said. It was Diane, formal, efficient, the way Diane was always formal and efficient. Was he available for a call at 3 o'clock with Ms. Vale? He said yes. He went back up the ladder, finished the panel, and spent the next 90 minutes in a fairly sustained state of low-grade tension that he managed by focusing very precisely on the mechanical details of the ceiling work and not thinking about anything else. 3 o'clock he was in his truck in the parking lot. Marissa's voice, when the call connected, gave him nothing useful. She sounded the same, as she always sounded. "The evaluation panel completed their review this morning," she said. "I want to be clear that I've seen the results, but I was not on the panel and had no input into the scoring." "I understand," he said. "You submitted the highest scoring proposal," she said. "By a meaningful margin, not a narrow one. The project is yours if you want it." He sat in his truck in a parking lot in Evanston in early March with slush on the ground and a gray sky above the strip mall across the street, and he felt something move through him that was large enough and complicated enough that he didn't try to name it. "Yes," he said. "I want it." "The formal offer goes to you this week," she said. "Terms as discussed. Travel planned in advance. Deputy authority built into the structure from day one." A brief pause. "Your model applied to your project." "Thank you," he said. "Panel scored it," she said. "Thank them." But something in her voice, just a small thing, just a particular quality in the brief pause before she'd moved on, told him she was not entirely uninvested in the result, even if she'd kept herself off the panel. He didn't say anything about that. He wasn't sure he was ready to. The Midwest rollout began in April. The first two months were harder than the proposal had made them sound, which was always true of plans when they encountered actual conditions. 3 of the 12 facilities had infrastructure configurations that differed from the survey documentation, a pattern Elliot recognized immediately. Since it was precisely the same class of problem, he'd spent 3 weeks uncovering the previous winter. He added a documentation audit to the onboarding process for each site, which cost time up front and saved considerably more later. His deputy was a woman named Petra Vasic, 38 years old, 12 years of field operations experience, and the kind of temperament that didn't panic under pressure, but also didn't pretend things were fine when they weren't. He'd requested her specifically, based on a reference from an Indianapolis facility manager, who'd described her as the person you want when things go sideways, which was exactly the kind of recommendation he trusted. He spent the first 6 weeks cooking alongside Petra, deliberately not supervising, but moving in parallel, making decisions jointly, explaining his reasoning out loud so she could disagree with it when she had cause to. She disagreed twice in the first week, both times correctly. He told her so, specifically, and moved on. "You're not going to have a problem with me overruling you?" she asked after the second time. "Only if you overrule me wrong," he said. "Both times you were right." "I'll tell you when you're wrong, too." She looked at him for a moment. "Most project leads don't operate that way." "I know," he said. "That's the problem I'm trying to fix." By June, the rollout was running with the particular quiet efficiency of a system that had been designed with failure in mind. Not a perfect system, there were delays. Miscommunications, a vendor delivery problem in the Illinois sites that cost them a week and required a creative scheduling solution, but a system that handled problems without producing crises, because no single point of failure could cascade into a shutdown. When something went wrong, someone with genuine authority and genuine knowledge was already positioned to address it. Elliot checked in with Marissa every 2 weeks. The calls were professional, focused, 30 minutes of status update and problem flagging and occasional strategic discussion. She asked us questions, he gave direct answers. The dynamic they'd established over the winter had settled into something that functioned with remarkable smoothness, and he trusted it, and he didn't think about what existed underneath the professional surface of it any more than was useful. Which was not entirely honest, but it was manageable. He was doing better with Nora. Genuinely better, not in the way a person tells themselves they're doing better, while continuing the same patterns with better vocabulary. He'd started asking her opinion before he'd finished forming his own on things that affected their life together. And the difference it made, the specific quality of ease in her expression when she was included, rather than informed, was something he noticed every time and couldn't quite get used to. They put a calendar on the kitchen wall, a large paper one, the kind with wide squares for each day, and they filled it in together her school events and his scheduled site visits and the blocks where he'd be in Milwaukee or Rockford or Grand Rapids. When a conflict appeared, they talked about it. When it couldn't be avoided, they planned around it. It was not a perfect system. Some weeks it felt like an exercise in triage, but it was real, and it was theirs, and it had been built by asking instead of deciding. The Wisconsin problem began on a Thursday in November. Elliot was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. The facility there was in the final verification stage, 2 days from completion sign-off, and he'd driven up Monday intending to be back in Chicago by Friday. The week had gone cleanly. He'd been in a good enough mood Wednesday evening to call Nora just to talk, not about logistics, just to hear about her day, and she'd told him about a debate tournament coming up Saturday that she was cautiously confident about. Cautiously, he'd said. "My partner's solid, but she gets nervous in cross-examination," Nora said. "If I can handle most of the cross, we're fine. If I can't cover for her, it depends on the judges." "You can handle cross," he said, usually. A pause. "Are you coming back Friday?" "Friday afternoon. I'll be home for dinner." "Okay." She sounded satisfied with this, the specific satisfaction of someone who has checked a logistical box. He'd gone to bed Wednesday in a hotel room in Grand Rapids, pleased with the week, thinking about Friday's drive home. He woke up Thursday to 2 missed calls from Petra and a text sent at 2:17 in the morning. North Star Madison facility. Monitoring system failure, grid backup not initiating. Team on site but can't isolate. Weather's bad and getting worse. Calling you. He sat up in the hotel bed at 5:50 in the morning, looked at the text, and felt the thing he'd been preparing for and dreading in equal measure arrive without any of the clarity that preparation was supposed to provide. He called Petra. She picked up on the first ring. "I've been on site since 11 last night," she said, without preamble. Primary monitoring array failed during the storm. Temperatures dropping at 17 degrees outside and falling, and the backup grid isn't initializing. I think it's the sequencing protocol on the new controller, but I can't confirm remotely, and the on-site tech doesn't have clearance to access the controller firmware. What's the facility status? running on manual checks every 30 minutes. It's sustainable for now, but if the temperature drops below 12 and the backup grid doesn't come up, we have a condensation risk in the server environment. That's a 4 to 6 hour window before it becomes a hard problem. Elliot got out of bed. He was already calculating. North Star Madison was 240 miles from Grand Rapids. In normal conditions, 4 hours. In Wisconsin, in November, in whatever weather had produced 17 degrees and falling, considerably longer. He pulled up the weather on his phone. Freezing rain, current, and forecast across a wide band of southern Wisconsin and northern Illinois. Travel advisories on I-90, reduced visibility, road closures possible. He looked at the time, 5:53 in the morning. Nora's debate showcase was Saturday. It was Thursday. He had a full day. He also had Petra Vasic, who had been making genuine decisions with genuine authority for 7 months, who had been on site since 11 the previous night, who knew the North Star Madison facility's systems at the same level of depth he did because he'd built the structure to ensure that would be true. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed and felt the old weight arrive, the familiar pull of the belief that he was the one who had to be there, that his physical presence was the solution, that anything short of driving immediately into a Wisconsin ice storm and spending 12 hours on a malfunctioning system was a dereliction of something essential. He recognized it. He'd spent the better part of a year learning to recognize it. He called Petra back. "Talk me through what you've already tried on the controller sequencing," he said. Talked. He listened, and while she talked, he pulled up the North Star facility documentation on his laptop, the version he'd personally verified against physical installation, because he'd applied that lesson across every site on the rollout. "The sequencing issue," he said when she finished. "Check the initialization queue in the backup controller. There should be a timestamp handoff between the primary shutdown signal and the backup startup command. If the storm caused a power fluctuation before the primary array fully shut down, the handoff signal may not have completed." Silence for a moment. He could hear her moving. "How do I access the initialization queue?" she asked. He walked her through it, step by step, with the specific cursor paths and command sequences, from memory that he'd built deliberately over 7 months of working this system alongside her. 12 minutes later, she said, "Found it. The timestamp handoff is showing an incomplete flag. Can you reset it from there? Give me a second." A pause. Keyboard. It sounds. "Yes." Initiating now, he waited. "Backup grid is initializing," she said. Her voice was steady. He could hear the particular quality of someone who is very tired and very relieved and not going to make a thing of either. "It's coming up. Temperature monitoring is active. We're okay." He let out a breath he'd been holding for 20 minutes. "Good work," he said. "You walked me through it. You were on site at 11 at night in a Wisconsin ice storm," he said. "That's not nothing." A brief pause. "Are you still coming?" He looked at the weather on his phone. He looked at the time. "No," he said. "You've got it. Do a full system verification once the backup grid stabilizes and send me the report. I'll review from here, and we can conference with the facility manager this afternoon." "Okay," she said. And then Carver. "Yeah, this is the part of your model that actually works," she said. He sat on the hotel bed for a moment after the call ended, in the dark and quiet of a Grand Rapids hotel room at 6:14 in the morning, and didn't say anything to anyone. He thought about standing in that lobby 5 months ago, telling Marissa Vale that a system that depended on one person was a system waiting to fail. He hadn't fully believed it about himself. Not completely. He'd believed it intellectually, had written it into a proposal and applied it to 12 facilities across 3 states. But there was a part of him, the part that had been choosing to be indispensable for 3 years, because being indispensable was protection against the fear of being absent, that had quietly held on to the belief that his presence, specifically, was the irreplaceable ingredient. Petra had just fixed the problem without him, and the North Star facility was fine. And he was sitting in a hotel room in Michigan, and the system he'd built to not need him had worked. He showered, dressed, and went downstairs to the hotel's breakfast area and ate eggs and bad coffee and stared out the window at a gray Michigan morning for a while. Then he called Nora. She picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant she was already up. She woke early on school days, a habit she'd apparently developed independent of any parental requirement. "Hey, aren't you in Grand Rapids?" "Still here," he said. "Problem at a Wisconsin facility last night. My deputy handled it." "So you don't have to go to Wisconsin?" "No." "Good." A pause. "The roads are bad there. I saw it on the weather." He looked at the window. I know. Are you up early for something? Debate practice, she said, 6:30 at Yolanda's house. She needs cross-examination work. He'd forgotten about Yolanda. Partner who got nervous. Is it helping? Getting better, Nora said. She's actually good at it when she's not thinking about being judged. The trick is to get her doing it before her brain catches up. A pause. That probably sounds weird. No, he said. It sounds accurate. She made a small sound of acknowledgement. Are you coming home Friday still? Friday afternoon. Same as I said. Okay. He could hear her moving, getting her things together. The rustle of a bag. I'll see you then. Text me when you leave. I will. Drive safely. The roads in Michigan are probably bad too. The roads in Michigan are fine, he said. They said they might get freezing rain this afternoon. Nora, I'm just saying. I'll drive safely, he said. Okay. A pause. Bye, Dad. Bye. He sat with the phone after the call, in the breakfast area of the hotel, surrounded by the low noise of other travelers. He thought about her voice, the particular easy authority of it, the way she managed concern and information as sometimes simultaneously without making it feel like worry. She'd been doing that more since the fall, since the kitchen table conversation about the folder. Less guarded, more present. He drove home Friday afternoon on roads that were fine. The debate showcase was Saturday at 2 o'clock in the auditorium of a high school on the north side of the city. Elliot got there at 1:40. He'd been home since Thursday evening and had no reason not to be early and found a seat in the third row. The auditorium filled slowly with parents and teachers, and the specific awkward energy of students performing preparedness they were not entirely sure they possessed. Elliot watched the teams arrange themselves at the front tables and recognized Nora immediately the way he always recognized her in a crowd. Something about the way she held herself. The particular upright but not stiff posture that suggested readiness rather than tension. She found him in the third row, gave him a single nod, the kind that said, I see you, don't make a thing of it. He gave her back the same nod. Yolanda was beside her, a girl he'd met once briefly a month ago. She was scanning the auditorium with the expression of someone who was already preparing to be terrified. He watched his daughter say something to her partner without looking at her. A few words, quiet, timed well. Yolanda's shoulders came down about half an inch. The first round started. Elliot had been to school events throughout the year, volleyball matches, a science fair, the geography presentation she'd rehearsed in the living room, but he hadn't watched her do this before. And he wasn't prepared for it. Not for how good she was. Not for the specific quality of her attention in the room, the way she tracked the opposing arguments in real time. The way she built her responses not around what she'd planned to say, but around what had actually been said. She was calm. She was precise. She did exactly what she'd told him she would do, covered the cross-examination when Yolanda faltered, gave her partner room when she didn't, distributed the load between them with the unconscious efficiency of someone who had thought about this beforehand. 3 rounds. They won 2, lost the third to a team from Westview that was, Elliot thought, objectively very good. He found Nora in the lobby afterward, Yolanda beside her, both of them carrying the specific particular energy of people who are more relieved than disappointed. Second round was the best one, Nora told him. Yolanda destroyed their second speaker in cross. It was actually great. I did not destroy anyone, Yolanda said, but she was smiling. You absolutely destroyed him, Nora said, with the comfortable authority of someone stating something she had directly witnessed. She looked at her father. We're going with Yolanda's parents for dinner. Is that okay? He looked at his daughter. Standing in a school lobby on a Saturday afternoon, Yolanda beside her, carrying her bag over one shoulder, looking at him with the easy expectation of a person who already knew the answer was yes and was asking because they'd agreed to ask. That's fine, he said. What time should I expect you?
9:30?
She looked at Yolanda. 9, Yolanda said. 9, Nora confirmed, already turning toward the exit, with the focused purpose of a person who has moved on to the next thing. She paused, turned back. Thanks for coming. I wouldn't miss it, he said. She gave him the nod again, the same one from earlier, the CU one, and disappeared into the lobby crowd with Yolanda. He stood in the lobby for a moment after she'd gone. Around him, parents were collecting their children. Teachers were managing the logistics of departure, the noise of an auditorium after an event moving through its particular winding down. He didn't move immediately. He thought about the hotel room in Grand Rapids Thursday morning, about Petra's voice when the backup grid came online, about the system holding without him. He thought about Nora in the second round of debate covering cross-examination with the calm competence of someone who had practiced at this table, against this opposition, and knew what she was doing. He thought about 3 years of decisions made without asking. His phone buzzed. A text from Petra, full system verification complete. North Star Madison is stable. Detailed report in your inbox. Good weekend. He typed back, good work this week. Seriously, put his phone in his pocket. He walked out of the school into a November afternoon that was cold and clear, the freezing rain from Wisconsin having stayed north of the city, the sky a particular sharp blue that only happened after cold fronts came through and swept everything clean. He stood on the sidewalk outside the school for a moment. The system had worked. Petra had handled Wisconsin without him. Nora had handled the debate without him. And both of those things were supposed to feel like loss. That was how he'd always framed the idea of not being indispensable, somewhere underneath all the professional language about redundancy and distributed authority. Somewhere underneath it, being needed had been the thing that made him feel like he was doing it right. Standing on a sidewalk in November with Petra's text on his phone and the image of Nora in the second round still clear in his mind, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like something he didn't have a clean word for yet. He started walking toward where he'd parked the truck. The sky was very blue and the air was sharp, and the city was doing what the city always did, which was move around him with complete indifference and a great deal of noise, and he walked through it without hurrying, and the afternoon held in the particular way that certain afternoons hold when something has shifted just enough that the ordinary details of the world look slightly different than they did before, though nothing has actually changed except the angle of the light and whatever is happening inside the person walking through it. He got to the truck. He sat in it for a moment without starting it. He had the evening to himself. Nora was at dinner until 9. The apartment was empty. He could work, or he could eat something, or he could call someone. He looked at his phone. He thought about a text message that had ended with safe drive in February, and about the pause in Marissa's voice on the Tuesday call when she told him he'd won the competition, and about the way she'd said our model without correcting him when he'd said it first. He thought about Nora saying you like working with her across a kitchen table, with the particular expression of a person filing information rather than drawing conclusions. He sat in the truck for another minute. Then he started it, and drove home, and let the rest of it wait until he was ready, which felt, for the first time in a long time, like a thing that might actually be possible. The North Star's Madison report landed in Elliot's inbox Saturday evening, while he was eating leftover soup at the kitchen counter, waiting for Nora to come home. Petra's documentation was more thorough than he'd asked for, which told him something about who she was once given actual room to operate. She'd written not just what had failed and how she'd fixed it, but why the initialization queue had been vulnerable to that specific class of storm-induced failure, and what they should change in the standard configuration to prevent recurrence across the other 11 facilities. 3 pages of analysis, 2 pages of recommendations, a photograph of the controller display, showing the incomplete timestamp flag, exactly as she'd described it over the phone at 6 in the morning. He read it twice. He sent her back 1 paragraph. Her analysis of the initialization queue vulnerability was correct. Her recommended configuration change was the right fix, and she should implement it across all North Star sites at her discretion without waiting for his sign-off. That last part was new. He'd been building toward it for months, the transfer of implementation authority to Petra for operational decisions within her domain, and this was the first time the situation had made it not just logical but obvious. He also forwarded the report to Marissa with a single line of his own. System held. Deputy identified the fix and documented the prevention protocol. Recommend we apply Petra's configuration change as standard across all future rollouts. Marissa's reply came 40 minutes later. While he was washing the bowl, agreed on the configuration change. Full report is excellent. We should talk this week not about the rollout specifically. He read that last part twice. Not about the rollout specifically. He set his phone face down on the counter and finished washing the bowl. Nora came home at 9:12, which was close enough to 9 that he didn't say anything about it. She came in slightly flushed from the cold, dropped her bag by the door, and kicked her shoes off in the direction of the mat, without actually landing them on it. "How was dinner?" he asked. "Good. Yolanda's mom makes this soup." She made a gesture that conveyed something beyond description. "I need to get that recipe." "You don't cook." "I'm thinking about starting." She went to the refrigerator and stood in front of it with the door open. looking at its contents with the expression of someone who is not actually hungry, but finds the inventory reassuring. "Everything okay with the Wisconsin thing?" "Resolved," he said. Petra handled it. Nora closed the refrigerator without taking anything. "Good." She picked up her bag. "I'm going to shower and sleep." "Tournament kind of wrings you out." "You were good today," he said. Paused at the hallway entrance. Looked back at him. "You thought so?" "Yeah," he said. "The second round especially. The way you covered Cross, without making it look like you were covering, she didn't even know you were managing it." Nora looked at him for a moment, and the expression on her face was one he hadn't seen much, not the careful assessing look, not the patient watching look, but something younger and simpler than both. Something that was just pleased, without analysis. "Thanks," she said, and went down the hallway. He stood in the kitchen after she'd gone and thought about the text on his phone, not about the rollout specifically, and decided that, whatever it meant, it could wait until he was in a room with Marissa rather than a text thread, and that there was no version of this particular conversation that was going to go better by being rushed. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. He slept without difficulty. Both of these were new enough that he still noticed them. The meeting was Wednesday, mid-morning. Marissa's office this time, not a conference room, the first time he'd been in the actual office, rather than a neutral meeting space, which he registered as information without deciding what kind. It was a corner office, north and east facing, with a long desk positioned slightly away from the windows in a way that put her face toward whoever came in rather than in silhouette. He'd expected something more declarative, the kind of executive office that announced its occupant's importance before the occupant could speak. What he found was tidy and functional, with one wall of documents and technical references and a smaller cluster of objects on the desk that were personal without being sentimental. A framed photograph he didn't examine. A small succulent that looked like it had been forgotten about for several weeks, but had survived anyway. Coffee mug that said something on it he couldn't read from where he sat. Marissa was already at her desk when Diane showed him in. She looked up, said close the door, and waited for him to sit. He sat, he waited. She had the North Star report on her desk printed, with 2 tabs marking specific pages. She had the rollout summary he'd sent the previous week. She had a document he didn't recognize, face down near her right hand. "The rollout numbers came in from the analytics team this morning," she said. "Response delays are down 41% across the facilities that went live in the first phase. Regional teams are escalating fewer issues to the central operations desk because they're resolving them at the site level. 3 clients have asked what changed, because their service continuity metrics look different." She paused. "Better different." "Good," he said. "The board reviewed a preliminary summary last week," she said. "They want to know whether the model can be applied company-wide. Not as a pilot, not as a regional experiment, as the operational standard for all Aldridge field operations." He'd thought about this. Not specifically the board's question, but the larger shape of what the model meant if it worked at scale. He'd thought about it on the drive back from Grand Rapids, and at the kitchen table in the evenings, and in the particular way, ideas occupy the background of your thinking while you're doing other things. "It can," he said, with adjustments. "The deputy authority parameters need to be calibrated to each operational context. What works in field monitoring infrastructure is different from what works in logistics coordination or contract management. But the core architecture is transferable." "I agree," she said, "which is why I want to talk to you about what comes next." He waited. She picked up the face-down document and turned it over. It was a formal offer letter. He could see the Aldridge letterhead, the structure of the page. "Director of Field Operations Development," she said. "A permanent position. Your primary responsibility would be implementing the distributed authority model across all Aldridge field operations over a 3-year period. You'd build the training protocols, the authority frameworks, the deputy selection standards. You'd oversee the rollout leads the way you've overseen Petra, not doing the work for them, but building the structure that lets them do it well." He looked at the document on the desk between them. "Travel?" he asked. "Planned. 4 to 6 trips per quarter, minimum 2 weeks advance notice. If an emergency requires earlier deployment, you have standing authority to send a deputy instead. No operation in your division will be structured to require your personal presence in a crisis." She said it without a qualifying pause. "Those aren't concessions. They're built into the job description." "Because the model requires them," he said. "Because the model requires them," she agreed. "And because I've watched you work for 8 months, and I've seen what you can do when the structure matches the way you actually operate. She paused. This is what the structure looks like. He looked at the offer letter. He didn't pick it up yet. I'm not going to give you an answer today, he said. I'm not asking for one today. I need to review the terms and talk to my daughter. Of course. And I have a question that isn't in the document. She looked at him steadily. Go ahead. He'd been working out how to say this for 3 days, since the text on Saturday evening, and he hadn't found a clean version, so he was going to say the unclean one. The text you sent Saturday, he said. Not about the rollout specifically. He held her gaze. Is this what you meant? She was quiet for a moment. Partly, she said. What's the other part? Another pause. She had the legal pad on the desk, but she wasn't touching it. Her hands were still in the particular way they got when she was thinking and didn't want the thinking to show. I've been trying to decide, she said finally, whether it's appropriate to say the other part. Given that I'm about to make you a formal employment offer. Probably not, he said. Technically. No, she agreed. Technically not. But, he said, because there was a but, and they both knew it. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved the same movement he'd first seen in the lobby 11 months ago. Brief and complicated and harder to categorize than her professional face. But I've been operating under the assumption that what exists between us is a professional relationship with clear boundaries, she said, and I've been finding it increasingly difficult to determine where exactly those boundaries are, which is not a position I'm comfortable with. I prefer to know where I stand. So do I, he said. Then I'll say this, she said. I respect you professionally. I find you genuinely interesting to think with, which is rarer than it should be. And I've been aware, for longer than I should probably admit, that the professional part is not the whole of it. She said it flatly, without drama. I'm not asking you to do anything with that information. I'm telling you because I don't like operating in ambiguity I can control. He sat with it. The office was quiet. Outside the north windows, Chicago was doing what it always did: gray sky, distant movement, the indifferent continuity of a city that doesn't stop for anything. I've been aware of the same thing, he said, since probably February, the night I finished the Milwaukee report. She looked at him. The text, he said, safe drive. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, but recognition, like someone confirming a calculation they'd already run, but hadn't spoken aloud. That's a very small data point, she said. I'm an engineer, he said. I notice patterns. The corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. He'd seen it happen before, always briefly, always followed by the return of the composed professional face, but he'd learned, over 8 months of working with her, that the brief version was the real one. Here's where I am, he said. I'm going to take this offer letter home. I'm going to review it and talk to Nora and come back to you with a decision by the end of next week. Whatever that decision is, it's going to be made on the merits of the job. He paused. The other part, the thing you just said, and the thing I just said, that's a different conversation. One that doesn't belong inside this office or attached to this offer. Not because I don't want to have it, because having it here would complicate both things, and neither of them deserves to be complicated by the other. She looked at him for a moment. That's a very deliberate position, she said. I'm a deliberate person. I know, she said. It's occasionally frustrating. I know, he said, I've been told. She held his gaze for a beat longer than was professionally necessary. Then she looked down at the legal pad and made a small notation that he was fairly sure was not about anything substantive. End of next week, she said. End of next week, he confirmed. He took the offer letter. He stood. She did not try to extend the conversation, which he appreciated. She had the same instinct he did about the point at which a thing has been said, and adding more words would only take away from it. He said goodbye to Diane on his way out and rode the elevator down 31 floors and walked through the lobby, the same stone floors, the same cold November light falling through the same glass and out through the revolving doors, onto the same sidewalk where he'd stood 11 months ago with nothing but his pride and a decision he'd been certain was the right one. Stood there for a moment. He thought about that version of himself, the man who had walked out of this building 11 months ago, carrying a grief he'd packaged as responsibility, making choices for a 14-year-old who had never been asked what she wanted, building walls out of love and fear in proportions he hadn't been honest enough with himself to measure. He didn't feel superior to that man. He understood him too well. The decisions that man had made were not wrong. Exactly, they were made with what he had, with the tools grief leaves you and the instincts that survival builds. You don't get to look back at the choices you made in your hardest years with contempt. You just get to look at them clearly, finally, and understand what they cost and what they protected, and what you do differently, now that you're not in the same place anymore. He started walking toward the parking structure. He talked to Nora that evening. All of it this time. Not simplified. Not the version designed to protect her from the weight of it, the actual version. With the full scope of what was being offered and what it would mean, and what he'd said to Marissa and what she'd said back. Well, not quite all of it. He left out the personal conversation. That particular thread belonged to him alone for now, until he knew what to do with it. But everything else, the job, the travel structure, the 3-year scope, the salary that was more than he'd ever made, he laid out plainly. At the kitchen table, over the pasta she'd made this time, which was not as good as his, but was genuinely not bad. Nora listened, the way she always listened, pen set down, full attention, the thing she'd developed that looked like patience, but was actually something more active. When he finished, she said, "Do you want it?" "Yes," he said. "Do the terms work?" "I think so. I want to review the document carefully. But the structure is what I designed, travel planned in advance. Deputy authority built in from the start. It's what I asked for." "So they actually listened," she said. "They built the job around the model," he said, "which means they're not doing me a favor. They're implementing their own operational strategy." Nora considered this. "That's better," she said, "than a favor." "I thought so too." She picked up her fork, ate for a moment. He waited. He'd learned to wait for her to come to the actual question, which was usually not the first thing she said. "What happens to us?" she said, like practically. "Day to day. 4 to 6 trips per quarter," he said. 3 to 5 days each, all scheduled in advance. We'd put them on the calendar the way we've been doing. You'd know my schedule 6 to 8 weeks out. Minimum. So not more than it's been, she said. About the same as the rollout. Maybe slightly more on busy quarters, less on lighter ones. She thought about this with the focused practicality of a person doing an actual calculation. "I can do that," she said. "I've been doing that." She paused. "It's actually been fine, Dad. When I know what to expect, it's fine." He looked at his daughter. "I know," he said. "You were more worried about it than I was," she said. Not accusatory, just accurate. "I know that too." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her pasta. "Take the job," she said, with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone announcing a conclusion to a problem that was never really complicated once you looked at it clearly. He signed the offer letter Friday morning and sent it back before he could build a case for waiting longer. He called Marissa to confirm, rather than emailing, because some things deserved a voice. "I saw it come in," she said. 10 minutes ago. It's a good offer," he said. "Structure is what I needed." "I know," she said. "That's why we built it that way." A pause. He could hear faintly the ambient sound of her office, the low noise of a building going about its business. "Carver," she said. "Yeah, the other conversation," she said. "The one that doesn't belong in the office." "Yes." "I'd like to have it," she said. "When you're ready. At a time and place that has nothing to do with Aldridge Systems." He thought about the lobby 11 months ago. About the particular way she'd crossed it, not because protocol required it, not because it served any professional purpose, but because she'd decided she wasn't ready to let something walk out the door, and Marissa Vale acted on her decisions. He thought about February and Safe Drive, and the Columbus Bay 7 correction sent at 8:30 in the evening, and 2 hours and 20 minutes of conversation that neither of them had intended. He thought about a small succulent on a desk that had been forgotten about for weeks, but had survived anyway. "I'm ready," he said. Another pause. A different quality to it. "Saturday," she said. "There's a place near the river, not a business lunch place. Just a place. Noon. Send me the address," he said. "I will," she said. And then, with the same clean directness she applied to everything, "I'm glad you took the job. I'm glad you offered it the right way," he said. She almost laughed. He could hear it, the almost. The restraint, and underneath the restraint, something that was warm in a way he was done, pretending he hadn't noticed. "Noon Saturday," she said, and ended the call. The next several months had the particular quality of a life that is being built rather than maintained. Company-wide implementation of the distributed authority model began in February, a year after Elliot had first walked out of a lobby without the job. The scope was considerable: 43 field operations teams across Aldridge's full-service territory, each requiring customized authority frameworks and deputy development plans calibrated to their specific operational context. It was the most complex professional project Elliot had ever managed, and it was complex in the best way, the kind that required genuine thinking rather than the application of a template. He built a team. Not large 6 people, carefully chosen for a specific combination of field experience and the ability to transfer knowledge rather than hoard it. Petra Vasic was the first person he asked. He'd moved to Chicago in December, which had made the conversation easier. I assumed this was coming, she said when he laid out the role. Was that a yes? That was a yes dressed as an observation, she said. He hired 4 others over 2 months, each one selected with the same criterion he'd used for Petra. He wanted people who got better results when they shared authority than when they kept it. That quality was harder to interview for than it sounded. He developed questions for it. He was wrong about 2 candidates he'd initially favored and caught the error early enough to matter. The work was difficult and specific and regularly produced situations he hadn't anticipated, which he had come to accept as the accurate shape of any real undertaking. Things that don't surprise you aren't complicated enough to be worth doing. Or that was what he told himself on the weeks when the surprises came faster than the solutions. He reported to the board twice in the first year. He did not find this part comfortable. He was not a natural performer in front of groups of executives who wanted confidence projected at them, but he gave them accurate information clearly organized, which was what they actually needed, even when it wasn't what they'd asked for. And Marissa, who attended both presentations, did not suggest he be more reassuring than the data warranted. You told them the Phase 2 timeline was at risk, she said, after the second board presentation. It is, he said. I know, she said. I'm not criticizing. I'm noting that most people in that room would have said it differently. More optimistically, more palatably. Palatable and accurate aren't the same thing, he said. No, she agreed. They're not. And she moved on to something else. And he understood this was also how she operated. She said the thing she wanted him to hear, confirmed he'd heard it, and didn't repeat herself. The Saturday by the river had been the beginning of something that neither of them rushed or dramatized, which suited them both. It was not a simple thing. 2 people with Elliot and Marissa's particular histories and particular habits of mind and particular attachment to self-sufficiency do not simply fall into each other without friction. They had friction. They had a specific, recurrent friction about when to include the other person in a problem and when to handle it independently, which was ironic given the professional model they'd both built their work around, and which Marissa pointed out once, with the particular dry precision she reserved for things she found both frustrating and interesting. You tell your deputy teams to share authority, she said, and then you sit on a problem for 3 days before mentioning it to me. That's different, he said. How? He thought about it honestly, because she'd earned that. Because telling Petra something acknowledges a professional dependency, he said. Telling you something acknowledges a personal one, and I'm slower at that. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. I'm not criticizing, I'm noting it so you know that I notice. It's your version of patience, he said. It is, she said. Try not to exhaust it. He tried. He wasn't always successful, and she had her own equivalent friction she had lived for so long inside a specific kind of self-constructed competence that the architecture of it had become invisible to her. And the moments when it showed itself were usually the moments she least wanted to be seen. They were learning each other's particular blindnesses, which was a slower process than either of them would have preferred, and more necessary than either of them wanted to admit. What they had, consistently, was the quality that had been there from the beginning. They thought well together. The same instinct for precision, the same tolerance for actual disagreement, the same impatience with answers that sounded good but couldn't hold weight. They pushed each other in ways that made both of them better at what they did, and neither of them had encountered that often enough to take it lightly. He did not save her from anything. She had not needed saving, had built a life and a company and a particular form of self-possession that had nothing to do with his arrival in it, and would have continued without him without any notable lack. The wheelchair was not a problem waiting for his help. It was simply part of how she moved through a world she'd been navigating, with intelligence and stubbornness and occasional spectacular efficiency, since long before he'd walked into a lobby carrying a dead man's suit and a daughter's expectations. What she had, and what he saw in her, was the specific grace of someone who had faced something genuinely hard and had not allowed it to make her smaller. Could have. He understood the temptation he'd spent 3 years, allowing his own grief to make him smaller, building walls and calling them protection. Marissa had chosen something else, to expand into the difficulty rather than contract away from it. It had cost her in ways she mentioned once or twice and then didn't mention again, because she was not a person who found repetition of the past particularly useful. He respected her in the specific way that only comes from watching someone do something difficult and do it well. She respected him in the specific way that comes from watching someone recognize a mistake and change. Whether respect was the same thing as love was a question he didn't spend much time analyzing. He'd learned in the past 2 years that he was better at living things than naming them. Nora met Marissa in March, 4 months after the Saturday by the river. Not arranged as a formal introduction that had felt too heavy and too deliberate for people, who were all, in their different ways, wary of things that announced themselves before they'd earned their weight. It happened because Nora needed a ride home from school, and Elliot was in a meeting that ran long, and Marissa, who was in the building's lobby waiting for him, had offered, and Nora had accepted with the easy pragmatism of a 15-year-old who needed a ride and didn't attach more significance to logistics than they warranted. Elliot came down to find them in the lobby, talking. Not performing getting along, actually talking, in the specific way of two people who have found something substantive to say to each other. He stood at the elevator for a moment and watched without interrupting. Later in the car, he asked Nora what they'd talked about. Debate, she said. She asked about my event structure. She actually knows about policy debate, like actually knows. Not the polite version of knowing. She was on her university team, Elliot said. Nora turned to look at him. You didn't tell me that. It didn't come up. It definitely should have come up. She turned back to the window. She said cross-examination is about identifying the gap between what someone believes and what they can actually prove. I've been thinking about it wrong. How have you been thinking about it? Like a contest, Nora said. She said it's not a contest, it's a diagnostic. He drove. He said nothing. I like her, Nora said after a moment. Not making a production of it. Just stating it. Yeah, he said. She doesn't try to be likable, Nora said. Which is why she is. He thought about that for the rest of the drive home, and decided his daughter had said something accurate and useful that would probably have taken him 3 more months to articulate. Kitchen calendar in the Carver apartment went through 3 replacements over the following year because it filled up. Not chaotically with structure, the kind they'd built together over months of practice. Elliot's work trips in their planned blocks, marked 2 months in advance in the blue pen that lived on the refrigerator. Nora's debate tournaments and school events in the black pen she claimed as hers. The blocks where their schedules overlapped and the blocks where they didn't, and the standing rule that any conflict in the overlap got talked about before it became a problem. There were conflicts. Some of them were genuinely difficult, a company-wide leadership summit scheduled the same week as Nora's regional debate finals, which required 3 conversations and a revised travel itinerary, and Petra flying in to cover 2 days of Elset's summit obligations so he could be in the auditorium for the final round. Nora placed second. She was disappointed in the way you're disappointed when you worked hard and almost made it, which is the kind of disappointment that eventually, once the sting goes out, turns into evidence of how far you've come. Elliot was in the auditorium for all 3 rounds. He didn't make a thing of it. Neither did she. They'd gotten better at that, at the necessary things that didn't need to be made into things. The note on the refrigerator. The text when he left for the airport. Standing Thursday dinner when he was in town, which was more nights than not. The conversations about his work, her school, Marissa, her friends, the debate team, the succulent on Marissa's desk that had finally died and been replaced with a different succulent that looked like it was heading in the same direction. Nora had opinions about all of it, which she expressed with the comfortable authority of a person who had been invited into the conversation and intended to use the invitation. One evening in April, a Thursday, their dinner night, she said, out of nowhere. In the middle of a conversation about her history class, do you think you'll marry her? He looked at his daughter. I think that's a conversation I'd have before you would, he said. Obviously, she said. I'm asking what you think. He thought about it. Not to deflect, but because she'd asked an honest question and she deserved an honest answer. I don't know, he said. I think we're both people who move carefully on things that matter. Neither of us wants to be wrong about something this size. That makes sense, Nora said. She ate for a moment. I'm asking because I want you to know I wouldn't have a problem with it, in case that's a thing you're factoring in. He looked at her across the kitchen table, 15 years old. Dark eyes, her mother's. Fraying cuff on a different hoodie, she had several, all in various stages of fraying, which was apparently the current uniform of a specific type of 15-year-old girl in Chicago. Eaten pasta on the plate in front of her, completely composed. It's a thing I'd factor in, he said. Well, now you know, she said, and went back to her pasta. He stayed quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. Outside, spring had finally arrived in the tentative, easily reversed way that spring arrived in Chicago, a week of real warmth, then 10 days of cold, then warmth again, working up to the thing gradually, as though the city needed convincing. Your mom would have liked her, he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Came out cleanly, without the weight it would have carried a year ago. Nora looked up. Yeah, she said softly. I thought that too. They didn't add anything to it. There wasn't anything to add. Some things are said and complete, and the most respectful thing you can do is let them be. There is a thing that happens to people who survive a significant loss, a spouse, a parent, a version of themselves they'd built their identity around, where they construct a life that is carefully sized to what they believe they are still allowed to want. Not consciously, not through any decision they could name at the time. Just the slow daily work of making peace with a reduced horizon, telling themselves the reduction is wisdom rather than fear. Elliot Carver had done this for 3 years. He'd done it well, with genuine love and genuine commitment, and the reduced horizon had held everything he'd allowed himself to put in it. But a reduced horizon is still a reduction, and the specific grief of it, the grief inside the grief, the layer underneath the loss of his wife, was that he had started to believe this was simply what his life was now. Container-sized, manageable, safe. Nora had found the crack first with scissors she was looking for. Marissa had walked through the lobby when she hadn't needed to. And somewhere between those two moments, and all the moments between and after them, Elliot had started to understand that the protection he'd been building had protected him not only from the things he feared, but from the things he'd wanted, and that at some point past a certain age, past a certain number of years, of choosing carefully, over choosing fully, you stop being able to tell the difference between caution and resignation. He was 33 now. He would be 34 in November. These were not old numbers. He had been behaving in certain specific and important ways, as though they were. What he'd learned not as a lesson delivered cleanly in a moment of insight, but as something worked out slowly and imperfectly across a year and a half of changed behavior, was that the opposite of fear is not courage. Exactly. It's something quieter and more sustainable than courage. It's the decision to keep showing up for things that matter, even when you can't guarantee the outcome, because the alternative is not safety. The alternative is a life that never had the chance to surprise you. Nora had surprised him. Consistently, and in ways he hadn't seen coming, and in ways that had required him to be a better father than the one he'd decided he was. Marissa had surprised him, with her directness and her rigor and the small succulent that survived on insufficient attention, and the way she laughed briefly, reluctantly, and completely when something actually got to her. The work had surprised him. The distributed authority model, which he'd built out of professional logic, had turned out to be something he'd needed personally first. Stop making one person indispensable. Build systems that hold when you're not in the room. Trust someone else with the authority to fix it. He'd had to learn all of that about his own life before he could write it into a proposal. These things happen in no particular order. The lesson and the application don't always arrive together. Sometimes you solve the professional problem first and understand the personal one later. Sometimes it goes the other way. The only thing that matters is that you eventually look at both clearly and don't pretend the connection isn't there. One morning in late April, Elliot left for a 4-day trip to Detroit, the Phase 3 rollout. 3 facilities, all scheduled and documented 6 weeks in advance. He'd reviewed the deputy assignments with his team the previous week, confirmed the authority frameworks were in place, and verified that the people responsible for each site had the context and the standing to handle anything that came up without calling him. He stood at the apartment door with his bag. Nora was at the kitchen table, already in her school uniform, eating toast and reading something on her phone. She looked up when he opened the door. "Call me when you land," she said. "I will," he said, "and text me when you're leaving each day, so I know the schedule." "I always do." "I know." She went back to her phone. "Drive safely to the airport. I'm taking a cab." "Then cab safely," she said. He almost smiled. He held it together. "I'll see you Thursday," he said. "Thursday," she confirmed, not looking up. He stood at the door for one more moment. The apartment was warm and ordinary, her toast on the plate, his coat rack with her jacket and his jacket hanging together, the kitchen calendar on the wall with the Detroit trip marked in blue and her Thursday tournament marked in black, and the block circled in both colors where they overlapped at Thursday evening. He left without guilt, not because everything was resolved, not because he'd arrived at some state of completion where a man can walk out a door without the complex weight of the things he loves, but because the weight was no longer the same as the fear, and he'd learned to tell the difference. Nora did not watch him go. She was reading, eating her toast, being 15 and unhurried and present in the particular way of someone who is not afraid of what the morning will bring. She knew he was leaving. She knew he was coming back. She knew what to do in the time between. That was the thing he'd spent 3 years trying to give her, and he hadn't understood until recently that she'd been ready for it, long before he was ready to believe it. Across the city, Marissa Vale arrived at her office at 7:40, 40 minutes before her first meeting, and spent that time the way she always spent the first hour reading reports, flagging decisions that needed to be made, noting 3 things that required her attention, and delegating 2 of them to people who had the authority and the knowledge to handle them. On her desk, the second succulent was showing early signs of the same negligence that had taken the first one. She'd been informed of this by Nora, who had examined it critically on the occasion of her second visit to the office and declared that it needed either a new position near the window or a more reliable watering schedule. Marissa had moved it to the window. She looked at it now briefly before turning to her reports. It looked marginally better. It was difficult to tell with succulents. They survived things quietly, without announcing it, and you only found out they'd pulled through when you noticed, eventually, that they were still there. She had found, over the past several months, that she thought about this more than was probably warranted. She opened the first report. Outside the north windows, Chicago was doing what it did, gray sky lightening toward blue, the city's permanent low machinery of traffic and construction, and the river below carrying whatever the winter had put into it downstream toward something that wasn't winter anymore. Another day beginning. Another set of things that could go wrong and would be handled. Another morning in which nobody was waiting to be saved, and nobody needed to be only 2 people going about the ordinary, difficult, specific work of building lives that had room in them for what mattered, and the hard-won knowledge that this was enough. More than enough. It was everything.